7:22 a.m., May 19th, 2026. Evansville, Indiana. 4 unmarked federal vehicles turned onto a residential street in the Oakdale neighborhood and stopped 40 feet short of a gray Craftsman-style house with a late-model pickup in the driveway. 2 navy blue SUVs, 1 gray sedan, 1 black pickup. No lights, no urgency, no signal that anything unusual was about to happen on this Tuesday morning in southwestern Indiana. The neighbors whose trash cans were still at the curb did not look up. The woman walking her dog at the far end of the block did not slow down. Nothing about the scene announced itself. Estimated loss to federal housing programs, $4, $3 million. Span of the deception, 17 years. The warrant authorizing this arrest had been signed on a Tuesday in March of 2009. It had never been served. The man inside that house had spent nearly 2 decades building a new identity from the wreckage of a federal fraud case that never caught up with him. He had done it methodically, quietly. He had done it so successfully that 3 separate federal agencies had stopped looking. What broke the case open was not a tip, not an informant, not a surveillance operation. It was a zip code. A postal code the United States Postal Service had decommissioned 15 years earlier. And the person who noticed it was not a special agent. She was a contract auditor reviewing spreadsheets in a government office building in Indianapolis on a grey afternoon in October 2025, drinking her second cup of coffee before lunch. Her name was Dana Farrell. She had worked federal transportation grant audits for 11 years. She was not looking for a fugitive. She was doing exactly what her contract required. Reviewing logistics invoices submitted under a federal surface transportation grant administered through Indiana's Department of Transportation. Freight brokerage services, delivery confirmations, mileage reimbursements. The kind of documentation that moves through federal grant audits by the thousands every quarter, reviewed quickly, approved or flagged, filed and forgotten. Farrell was working through a batch of submissions from a small LLC registered in South Bend, Indiana. The company was called Midwest Corridor Solutions. It had been billing under the grant for 14 months. The amounts were not large, between $8,000 and $22,000 per invoice. Nothing that would have triggered an automated threshold alert. Nothing that would have drawn a second look from a routine compliance review. But Farrell had a habit. She had developed it years earlier, after catching a misfiled grant submission that turned out to involve duplicate billing across 2 state agencies. The habit was simple. She cross-referenced billing addresses against a secondary postal database she kept on her own workstation. Not official protocol, just something she did. She had never been asked to do it. She had never been rewarded for doing it. She simply did it, the way some people check the stove twice before they leave the house. The address on the Midwest Corridor Solutions invoices was a post office box in Gary, Indiana. The zip code listed was 46412. Dana Farrell typed the zip into her database. The system returned a result she had never seen before in 11 years of federal audit work. 46412 had been decommissioned by the United States Postal Service in 2011. It no longer existed as an active zip code. Any mail sent to that address for the past 14 years had been undeliverable. And yet a federally contracted vendor had been using it as their billing address on official grant submissions for over a year. She flagged it, noted the anomaly in her review log. Then, because the secondary database also carried historical association records for postal addresses, she ran one more search. The results stopped her cold. Zip code 46412 had been associated with a storage facility in Gary, Indiana. That storage facility had appeared in federal court documents. Specifically, in an FBI wire fraud warrant filed in the Northern District of Indiana in March 2009. The warrant named a subject, Cortland James Bellamy. Dana Farrell printed the search result. She read it twice. Then she walked down the hall to her supervisor's office and set the paper on his desk. "I think I found something," she said. "I'm not sure what it is, but I think you should look at it." Her supervisor forwarded the flagged invoice batch and the postal database result to the Indiana Office of Inspector General the following morning, October 14th, 2025. The referral was marked routine, anomalous vendor documentation, possible administrative error. At the Inspector General's office, the referral landed on the desk of an investigative analyst named Roy Casper. Casper had spent 6 years at the IG's office after an earlier career doing financial review for the Army Corps of Engineers. He pulled the original referral, read through Farrell's notes, and then did what Farrell had done. He looked up the 2009 warrant. What he found was a case file that had been effectively dormant for 12 years. The original investigation had begun in late 2007. The FBI's Chicago field office, working with the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Inspector General, had been tracking fraudulent disbursements under a Midwest housing rehabilitation program. The program was a federal block grant initiative designed to fund the repair and weatherization of low-income housing units across Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. It operated through local administering agencies, which contracted with private inspection firms and construction vendors to certify and complete the work. Someone was submitting falsified inspection reports, hundreds of them. Properties certified as rehabilitated that had never been touched. Contractors listed as completing work that had never been performed. Grant funds dispersed, absorbed, and disappeared into shell entities that existed only on paper. The FBI traced the scheme to a single organizing figure, Cortland James Bellamy. Bellamy was 44 years old at the time. He had a background in logistics and freight management. No prior federal fraud convictions. He had inserted himself into the housing program's supply chain years earlier, initially as a subcontractor, eventually as the coordinator of a network of fictitious vendors across 4 Midwest cities. The case file documented $3 million in fraudulent disbursements traced directly to entities Bellamy controlled. The FBI estimated the total impact of the broader scheme was significantly higher. The wire fraud warrant was issued in March 2009. Agents went to serve it. Bellamy was gone. I spent time going through the case documentation on this one, and one detail kept nagging at me. The warrant was never formally withdrawn. It remained active in the federal system for 17 years. But by 2013, the FBI had formally suspended active pursuit. The case was not closed. The warrant was not rescinded. It just sat, technically alive, practically invisible, in a federal database that nobody was actively querying. What Bellamy had done after he disappeared was not complicated. It was patient. He did not flee to another country. He did not forge documents or build an elaborate false identity. He moved laterally. He dropped the use of his first name, Cortland, and began operating under a variant of his middle name, James. James Bellamy. It was barely a shift. But combined with a deliberate avoidance of any employment situation that would trigger a background check linked to his full legal name, it was enough. He moved from Chicago to South Bend. He built a small freight brokerage operation from scratch. He paid his taxes. He kept a low profile. For nearly a decade and a half, he had been hiding in the open. There is a woman named Gloria Tate who lived in a house on the south side of Gary, Indiana. She applied for the Housing Rehabilitation Program in 2008. She was 63 years old, a retired school cafeteria worker, and she owned the house outright, had paid it off over 31 years. The house had a foundation crack that let cold air in along the north wall every winter. The weatherization program was exactly what it was designed for. Her application was processed, approved, and assigned to a contractor, one of the fictitious entities in Bellamy's network. The paperwork came back within 6 weeks. Work completed. Inspection passed. The grant funds were dispersed. Gloria Tate's file was closed. She never saw a single worker. The crack in the foundation was still there in 2009. It was still there in 2015. It is there today. She did not know, for years, that the contractor had never existed. She did not know that the inspection had been signed by someone who was not a licensed inspector. She did not know that the funds released in her name had been routed through 3 shell entities and withdrawn from a bank account in Cicero, Illinois, within 9 days of disbursement. She found out when a local news outlet ran a brief item in 2011, 2 years after the warrant was issued, reporting on the federal investigation. Even then, the article did not name her. Her case was one of hundreds. The business Bellamy built, Midwest Corridor Solutions, was legitimate. Or rather, it was operationally legitimate. He was actually brokering freight. He was actually providing the services he billed for. The federal transportation grant was not, as investigators would determine, a vehicle for active fraud. The problem was the billing address. And the billing address was a mistake so specific that it could only have come from someone who had used that address before. Someone who, 17 years later, had let a small operational detail survive from a previous life. The question now was whether James Bellamy of South Bend, Indiana, was Cortland James Bellamy, subject of a 17-year-old federal warrant. Roy Casper referred the matter upward. Within 2 weeks, the referral had moved from the Inspector General's office to the FBI's Indianapolis field office. An agent named Patricia Dial was assigned to run the preliminary inquiry. Dial had 14 years of experience in financial crimes. She pulled the 2009 case file, the current grant records, and the corporate registration documents for Midwest Corridor Solutions. Midwest Corridor Solutions had been registered in St. Joseph County, Indiana in 2014. The registered agent was listed as James C. Bellamy. The address on the registration was a residential address in South Bend. There was no employer identification number cross-reference that directly linked the entity to Cortland Bellamy's known prior business entities. But the middle initial matched, the age matched, the operational profile matched, freight logistics, subcontract work, geographic footprint across the same Midwest corridor where the 2009 scheme had operated. Dial ran a federal database query against the name James C. Bellamy and the South Bend address. The query returned a utility account, a vehicle registration, and an Indiana driver's license. The license photograph showed a man in his early 60s, heavyset, with grey hair and a beard that had not appeared in any prior federal records for Cortland James Bellamy. She ordered a biometric comparison. It took the lab 4 days. The comparison came back on November 3rd, 2025. The fingerprint geometry from the Indiana driver's license matched the fingerprint records on file from Cortland James Bellamy's 2008 federal employment verification. Same man. Dial reported the match to the U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force. Here is what this case says about the gap between what federal warrant databases contain and what anyone is actually doing with that information. The 2009 warrant had been sitting in the system for over 16 years. Bellamy had registered a business in his own name, his actual middle name, had obtained a state driver's license in that name, had filed tax returns under that name. He was not hiding. He was operating with the quiet confidence of someone who had correctly assessed that nobody was looking. And for 16 years, he was right. The task force began building a current surveillance profile in November 2025. They confirmed his residential address in Evansville. He had relocated from South Bend in 2022. They confirmed his vehicle. They mapped his routine. Bellamy woke early, typically between 5:30 and 6 a.m. He drove to his brokerage office, located in a commercial strip building on the east side of Evansville, most mornings by 7:15. He stopped at the same gas station on Morgan Avenue 3 or 4 times a week. Medium coffee, the same brand of energy bar, usually paid in cash. He returned home by early evening. He had lunch alone at a diner on the north side 2 or 3 times a week. He did not appear to have close friends. He attended no regular social events, no travel record suggesting flight risk. He had been in the same routine for at least 18 months. Investigators watching him across 3 weeks of intermittent surveillance described him, in their operational notes, as methodical, predictable, a man who had structured his life around the absence of surprises. The task force applied for a federal arrest warrant on the existing 2009 case. The application was approved by the duty magistrate on December 2nd, 2025. Then they ran into an obstacle. The original 2009 case file had been maintained by the FBI's Chicago field office. When the Indianapolis team requested the full case documentation for arrest processing, they discovered that a portion of the financial records had been archived to an off-site federal storage facility during a 2017 records consolidation. The digital copies were incomplete. 3 of the key evidentiary exhibits, bank records from 2008 establishing the transfer chain from disbursement to Bellamy-controlled accounts, existed only in physical form at the archive facility. The archive facility was in Kansas City. The records request required a formal retrieval process that, under standard procedure, carried a 90-day processing window. The task force was not willing to wait 90 days. Agent Dial contacted the Chicago field office directly. A senior financial crimes analyst there named Marcus Webb had worked the original 2009 investigation before the active pursuit was suspended. Webb was still with the Bureau. He remembered the case. Webb flew to Kansas City. He personally retrieved the 3 archival exhibits, had them digitized on-site, and transmitted the files to Indianapolis within 72 hours. The records were formally entered into the current case file on December 11th, 2025. The financial chain was intact. The case for the 2009 charges remained solid. The question now was timing. The task force could move immediately, but the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit wanted to run a parallel inquiry into Midwest Corridor Solutions. Specifically, to determine whether Bellamy had been committing new fraud under the federal transportation grant or whether the grant relationship was genuinely legitimate. This is the part that doesn't make sense on the surface, and it took investigators several weeks to work through it. Cortland Bellamy appeared to have been running a clean operation under the grant. His invoices were supported by actual services rendered. His billing rates were within market range. No evidence of falsified documentation in the transportation grant record. The only anomaly was the decommissioned zip code, which investigators concluded was most likely a residual habit from the 2009 scheme, an old address that had been entered into his billing template years ago and never updated. He had been fraudulent in 2009. He appeared to be legitimate in 2026. The irony is almost architectural, the one remnant of his old criminal infrastructure. A defunct postal code was precisely what had brought him down. The parallel financial inquiry completed its preliminary review by early February 2026. No new fraud charges were recommended. The decision was made to proceed on the original 2009 warrant. What do you think? Does 17 years of apparent legitimate business operation change how we assess a fugitive's culpability? Drop your answer in the comments. Operations planning began in February. The task force coordinated with the Southern Indiana U.S. Marshals District, the FBI Indianapolis Financial Crimes Unit, and the Northern District of Indiana U.S. Attorney's Office, where the original charges were still pending. The arrest itself was not expected to be complicated. Bellamy had shown no indicators of a security posture. No weapons flagged in background records, no associates with criminal history, no surveillance evidence of counter-surveillance behavior. He appeared, in every operational dimension, to be exactly what he had been presenting himself as for 17 years, a 61-year-old freight broker with a quiet life in southwestern Indiana. But task force protocol required preparation for contingencies. 3 weeks before the planned arrest, investigators ran a final confirmation on his current address and vehicle. During that surveillance run, they identified a complication. Bellamy's routine had changed. He had been traveling out of state more frequently since January. 2 trips to Louisville, 1 to Columbus, Ohio. The travel pattern was not consistent with flight preparation, but it introduced uncertainty into the timing assumptions. The task force ran a secondary check on his phone account activity. Not content, but tower pings, location data authorized under the federal warrant application. The data confirmed that his Louisville trips had lasted between 6 and 11 hours each, consistent with a day business trip. The Columbus trip had lasted 22 hours. The task force ran the Columbus timeline against commercial freight, contracting databases, and identified a logistics conference that had taken place at a hotel near Columbus during that period. Bellamy had attended an industry event. Not fleeing. Networking. The task force adjusted. They shifted the planned arrest window from a weekday morning at his business location to a residential arrest at his home address, on a day when surveillance confirmed his vehicle was in the driveway and there had been no outbound travel in the preceding 48 hours. The date selected was May 19th, 2026. The arrest team staged 4 vehicles in the Oakdale neighborhood at 6:58 a.m. Surveillance had confirmed Bellamy's pickup in the driveway at 6:40. His lights had been on since approximately 6 o'clock. He was home. He had not left. The team moved on foot from their staging position at 7:22 a.m. 2 Marshals service deputies took the front approach. 2 FBI agents covered the side of the property. 1 additional deputy covered the rear access. The approach was unhurried. No tactical formation, no drawn weapons. The threat assessment had been low throughout. This was a financial crimes fugitive in his 7th decade, alone, in a residential house on a quiet street. The operational posture reflected that. The goal was a clean, quiet arrest. Nothing that would draw a neighbour's phone camera, nothing that would escalate what did not need to be escalated. The lead deputy knocked. 17 seconds passed. The front door opened. Cortland James Bellamy, 61 years old, grey-bearded, in a fleece vest and work boots, looked at the badge presented to him and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting for this." He made no attempt to resist. He did not ask for an attorney immediately. He did not run. He stepped back from the door, turned slightly, and set down the coffee mug he had been holding. The mug landed on the small table just inside the entry. The deputies noted in their report that the interior of the house was orderly. Neat. A coat hung on a hook by the door. A pair of boots on a mat. Nothing that looked like a man preparing to leave. The arrest was completed in under 4 minutes. There's a line in the arrest report that reads almost like fiction. When the booking officer asked Bellamy to confirm his full legal name for the record, he gave it without hesitation. Cortland James Bellamy. Not James. Not the abbreviated identity he had used for 17 years. His full name, offered voluntarily, as if being arrested had restored the original version of himself. The booking was completed at the Vanderbilt County Intake Facility. Bellamy was transported the same afternoon to federal custody in the Northern District of Indiana, where the original 2009 charges remained pending. The 2009 warrant was formally served at 8:47 a.m. on May 19, 2026. It had been written on a Tuesday. It was served on a Tuesday, 17 years and 61 days after it was signed. During the initial intake process, Bellamy made a single statement to the processing marshal that was recorded in the intake log. He said, "I knew the zip code was wrong. I kept meaning to fix it. Nothing else. No explanation. No elaboration." The statement was logged, forwarded to the case agent, and noted in the case file. Investigators who reviewed it later said it confirmed what they had already concluded, that the decommissioned postal code was not deliberate concealment, but a relic of sloppiness from another era of his life that had simply never been cleaned up. He had carried 17 years of careful, quiet legitimacy into an arrest triggered by a clerical error he had made sometime before 2025 and never corrected. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District filed a motion to proceed on the original indictment on May 21st. The charges included wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States. The statutory maximum exposure across the counts exceeded 30 years. Bellamy's appointed counsel entered a not guilty plea at the initial appearance. A detention hearing was held May 23rd. Bellamy was held without bond on the basis of the sustained flight history. 17 years as a federal fugitive constituted sufficient grounds. The magistrate determined to establish that no combination of conditions would reasonably assure his appearance. The financial recovery question was more complicated. The original $4. $3 million in trace disbursements had been distributed across multiple shell entities during the 2008 to 2009 period. Federal investigators in the original case had managed to freeze and recover approximately $610,000 before Bellamy disappeared. The remainder, roughly $3, $69 million, had moved through a sequence of accounts that the 2009 investigation had only partially traced before active pursuit was suspended. 17 years had not improved the recovery prospects for most of it. The Financial Crimes Unit reactivated the asset tracing effort in late May 2026. They were working with records from 2008 and 2009 against a financial infrastructure that had long since dissolved. Some of the accounts had been closed. Some of the entities had been formally dissolved. Some had simply become untraceable shadows in outdated banking records. Forensic accountants assigned to the review described the task in their preliminary assessment as attempting to reconstruct a building from its shadow. The paper trail existed in fragments. Individual transactions could be identified. What could not always be established was the chain of control, who had authorized which transfer, at which point the funds had moved from an entity Bellamy controlled to one he did not, and where the money had ultimately gone. We'll say it plainly. The 17-year suspension of active pursuit on this warrant represents a systemic failure that goes beyond Bellamy himself. A $4. $3 million federal fraud case, fully indicted, fully documented, with an active warrant, was effectively abandoned because of resource prioritization decisions made in 2013. The warrant technically stayed open. The pursuit actually stopped. Those are not the same thing. And the gap between them is where Bellamy lived for a decade and a half. By late June 2026, the Financial Crimes Unit had identified 2 additional bank accounts linked to Bellamy-controlled entities from the 2008 period. Combined, they contained approximately $87,000. Modest recovery against the total loss, but the only new financial accountability in the case since 2009. The full amount of unrecovered funds from the original scheme remains outstanding. Investigators have not identified any assets held by Bellamy in his current legal name that correspond to proceeds of the original fraud. Whatever remained of the $3, $69 million, if any portion of it survives in any recoverable form, has not been located. The question of what happened to the original housing program victims is not a simple one. The fraudulent disbursements came from federal grant funds, not directly from individual homeowners. The properties certified as rehabilitated but never touched continued to deteriorate. In some cases, occupants had applied for weatherization or repair assistance, received confirmation that work had been completed and approved, and lived for years in housing that remained in its original compromised condition. The agency-level impact across the 4 Midwest cities involved has never been fully audited. The audit is not planned. Dana Farrell returned to her regular caseload the week after the referral was forwarded to the Inspector General's office. She was not involved in the investigation that followed. She learned of Bellamy's arrest through a brief mention in a local news alert in May 2026. She confirmed the connection to her own referral. She went back to reviewing invoices. The warrant is served. The defendant is in federal custody. The trial date has not been set as of this writing. The $3, $69 million, most of it, anyway, has not been found. The housing program that was defrauded has not been audited for the full scope of damage. And somewhere in the federal warrant database, there are other files that look exactly like the 2009 Bellamy case did before October 14th, 2025. Technically open, functionally dead, waiting for a zip code that doesn't exist anymore, and someone patient enough to look it up. Will this happen again in 5 years? A dormant federal warrant cracked open by a routine database anomaly? Comment why yes or no. If you want to understand how federal fugitive cases actually stay alive, and which ones don't, subscribe. The next case in this file is already built.